Hi, my name is David Epstein, and I'm the author of Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. In 2014, I included some findings about late specialization in sports in the afterword of my first book, The Sports Gene. The following year, I got an invitation to talk about that research from an unlikely audience. Not athletes or coaches, but military veterans who were given scholarships by the Pat Tillman Foundation to aid in new career trajectories. In preparation, I perused scientific journals for work on specialization and career switching outside of the sports world, and I was struck by what I found. One study showed that early career specializers did jump out to an earnings lead after college, but that late specializers made up for that head start by finding work that better fit their skills and personalities. I found a raft of studies that showed how technological inventors increased their creative impact by accumulating experience in different domains compared to peers who drilled down more deeply into just one. I also began to realize that some of the people whose work I deeply admired had specialized later in life than I expected. As a kid, the famed jazz musician Duke Ellington actually shunned music lessons to focus on drawing and baseball. And Maryam Mirzakhani once dreamed of becoming a novelist, then became the first woman to win the Fields Medal, the most famous prize in all of mathematics. When I presented my findings to those veterans, they were thrilled about it. Many were transitioning from one career to another, and they found comfort in the fact that their range of past experience was not, in fact, a detriment, but a major benefit as they move forward in their professional lives. I wrote Range to share that insight with everyone, from the new college grad wondering where to begin to the mid-career professional considering a major change. And in this series of videos, I want to show you why generalists have such an advantage in the world today and offer specific tips to help you expand your range. The origin story of golf legend Tiger Woods sounds like something out of a comic book. At 6 months old, he could balance on his father's palm as he walked through their home. At 2, an age when the CDC lists developmental milestones like kicks a ball and stands on tiptoe, he went on national television and used a club tall enough to reach his shoulder to drive a ball past an astonished Bob Hope. That same year, he entered his first tournament and won the 10 and under division. Unsurprisingly, that little boy would grow into perhaps the greatest golfer who ever lived. But there's another very different kind of success story embodied by the tennis great Roger Federer. As a boy, he dabbled in squash, skiing, wrestling, swimming, skateboarding, plus some basketball, handball, badminton, and soccer. By the time he finally gave up those other sports to focus on tennis, other kids had long since been working with strength coaches, sports psychologists, nutritionists, but obviously that didn't seem to hamper his development in the long run. In his mid-30s, an age by which even legendary tennis players are typically retired, Roger was still ranked #1 in the world. Tiger's story has come to symbolize the idea that the quantity of deliberate practice determines success, and that practice must start as early as possible. But Roger's story indicates that maybe a head start isn't all it's cracked up to be, and the research suggests the same. For example, economist Ofer Malamud studied the trajectories of thousands of students in the United Kingdom. English and Welsh students had to specialize early before college so that they could apply to specific narrow programs. On the other hand, Scottish students were actually required to study different fields for the first 2 years of college and could keep sampling even beyond that. Compared to their later specializing Scottish peers, the graduates in England and in Wales were consistently more likely to leave their career fields entirely. With less sampling opportunity, they headed down a narrow path before figuring out if it was even a good one, and it often wasn't. Despite starting out behind in income because they did indeed have fewer specific skills, the Scots quickly caught up, in part because they had successfully identified careers for which they were well suited. So if you're afraid that you've missed your chance to pick up a new hobby or switch careers, you can officially put that fear to rest. Head starts are often overrated. It's never too late to pick a new path. And as we'll soon see, it actually may be beneficial in the long run. Like Roger Federer, Vincent van Gogh took quite a while to discover and develop his talent. He worked first as an art dealer, an assistant math teacher, a bookstore clerk, a failed would-be pastor. At age 33, he enrolled in art school alongside students a decade his junior. When he entered the class drawing competition, the judges examined his work and suggested that he revert to a beginner's class with 10-year-olds. He tried and failed to master watercolors and realism, expressionism, and landscapes, until he finally tried working with an easel and oil paints. And at last, he'd found his niche. He emerged with a new art, impetuous, slathered with paint, erupting with color, laden with no formality other than to capture something infinite. With the success of Angela Duckworth's fantastic book, Grit, it's easy to look at Van Gogh's winding, failure-laden path and dismiss it as the product of impatience or a lack of perseverance. But in reality, Van Gogh was in pursuit of what economists call match quality, the degree of fit between the work someone does and who they are, their interests and abilities. And if you believe that you'd find greater match quality at a different job or in a different career altogether, it may be a good idea to switch. The Freakonomics co-author, Stephen Levitt, once proposed a challenge to his readers. For those considering a life change, they should flip a digital coin. If it came up heads, they'd make the change. If tails, they wouldn't. Over 2,000 volunteers claimed they were considering a job switch, and 6 months later, those who flipped heads and switched jobs were substantially happier than those who stayed. Labor economist Kirabo Jackson has demonstrated that even the dreaded administrative headache known as teacher turnover captures the value of informed switching. He found that teachers are actually more effective at improving student performance after they switch to a new school, and that effect isn't explained by switching to higher achieving schools with better students. Teachers tend to leave schools at which they are poorly matched, he concluded. Especially now that we know how overrated Head Starts can be, there's a lot of potential benefit to pursuing match quality, even if that does mean quitting a couple times along the way. It's a scary leap to make, for sure, but the research is clear that switchers are often winners. When his first daughter was born, Laszlo Polgar decided that she would become a chess champion. After 8 months of intense study, Laszlo took 4-year-old Susan to a smoky chess club in Budapest and challenged grown men to play her. She won. Still at age 4, Susan entered the Budapest Girls Under-11 Championship. She won again. Laszlo started homeschooling Susan, focusing her education almost entirely on mastering chess, and it paid off. At 17, Susan became the first woman to qualify for the Men's World Championship. At 21, she became the first woman to achieve Grandmaster status through tournament play against men. And in 1996, she won the Women's World Championship. Underlying this story, however, is a simple assumption. Experience invariably leads to expertise. If that's true, it is best to specialize, to focus all your time and attention on one thing, and accrue as much experience as possible. But does more experience really lead to mastery? Susan's story certainly implies that it does. But in 2009, the psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Gary Klein discovered that actually it depends. Chess is what the psychologist Robin Hogarth called a kind learning environment, where pieces are moved according to known rules, consequences are quickly apparent, and similar patterns and challenges occur repeatedly. Golf is the same. You drive a golf ball, it either goes too far or not far enough. It slices, hooks, or flies straight. The player observes what happened, attempts to correct the error, tries again, and repeat. For years. That's the very definition of deliberate practice, the type identified with both the famous 10,000 hours rule and the push for intense early specialization. But not every learning environment is kind. Some are what Hogarth called wicked. In wicked domains, the rules of the game are often unclear, there may or may not be obvious repetitive patterns, and feedback is often delayed, inaccurate, or both. In these cases, old strategies may be ill-suited to dealing with the present challenges, which may differ from past ones in unpredictable and sometimes even unknowable ways. At the first sign of wickedness, specialists accustomed to a kind world will often struggle. In research in the game of bridge, for example, where the order of play was altered, experts actually had a more difficult time adapting to new rules than non-experts did. When experienced accountants were asked in a study to use a new tax law that replaced a previous one, they actually did worse than novices. So in your pursuit of success, start by determining whether your field is kind or wicked, where it is on that spectrum, and adjust your training strategy accordingly. Repetitive, narrow practice will turn you into a specialist well-suited for a kind domain, while learning in a wide variety of contexts will prepare you for a wicked one, where the ability to learn without the benefit of prior experience is critical. With automation and globalization speeding up change in workplaces and industries around the globe, we're living in an increasingly wicked world, and that suits generalists just fine. In 1931, the psychologist Alexander Luria visited a variety of remote Soviet villages that had not yet been touched by modernity or formal education. While there, Luria presented skeins of wool or silk to the villagers and asked them to sort them into groups. Young people with even a little formal education did so easily, naturally forming groups based on color, red, blue, and so on. The more remote villagers, on the other hand, refused. None of them are the same, they said. You can't put them together. They could see the colors just fine, but the very idea of a color as a concept unto itself was completely unthinkable to them. Geometric shapes were exactly the same way. The greater the dose of modernity, often in the form of education, the more likely an individual grasped the abstract concept of shapes and made groups of triangles, rectangles, and circles. The remote villagers, meanwhile, saw nothing alike in a square drawn with solid lines and the same exact square drawn with dotted lines. To Alieva, a 26-year-old remote villager, the solid line square was obviously a map. The dotted line square was obviously a watch. Stifling her ability to make new connections was the fact that she couldn't look beyond concrete objects or her direct experiences of the world. Modern work demands cognitive flexibility, the ability to make connections across domains, often to solve new problems we've never even seen before. And while our flexibility may be better developed than those of the villagers, it's not always advanced as you may think. Political studies professor James Flynn conducted a study in which he compared the grade point averages of seniors at a top American state university to their performance on the test of the kind of critical thinking you need to analyze a complex world. Even among students with a high GPA, many were terrible. In Flynn's words, the traits that earn good grades at the university do not include critical ability of any broad significance. Like the Soviet villagers, students struggled to identify and apply conceptual schemes involving anything beyond their immediate experience, that is, their chosen field of study. Their education is too narrow, Flynn concluded. So what can we do to improve our cognitive flexibility? Research on thousands of adults in 6 industrializing nations found that exposure to self-directed problem solving and non-repetitive challenges was correlated with being cognitively flexible. In other words, challenge yourself to take on novel tasks or projects that stretch your analytical and creative abilities. You could also try your hand at so-called Fermi problems, where you estimate broadly, such as, how many piano tuners are there in New York City? Give it a try. Several studies have found that a little training in broad thinking strategies like solving Fermi problems make a big difference, and that can be applied across domains. Lastly, in my opinion, it never hurts to read a book on an unfamiliar subject outside your domain. You'll not only acquire new knowledge, but also new ways of thinking, and that's the signature power of range. Suppose you're a doctor treating a patient with a malignant stomach tumor. There's a ray that can destroy the tumor, and if the rays reach the tumor all at once at a sufficiently high intensity, the tumor will be destroyed. Unfortunately, at that intensity, the healthy tissue that the rays pass through will also be destroyed. At lower intensities, the rays are harmless to healthy tissue, but they also won't affect the tumor. How can you use the rays to destroy the tumor and preserve healthy tissue? While you're thinking, here's a little story to pass the time. There was once a general who needed to capture a fortress from a brutal dictator. But the many roads leading to the fortress were strewn with mines, and only small groups of soldiers could safely traverse any one road. So the general divided the army into small groups, and each group traveled a different road leading to the fortress. By converging on the fortress at the same time, they successfully captured it and overthrew the dictator. So have you saved the patient yet? Don't feel bad, almost no one solves the puzzle at first. The answer is that you, the doctor, could direct multiple low-intensity rays at the tumor from different directions, leaving healthy tissue intact, but converging at the tumor with enough collective intensity to destroy it. Just like how the general divided up his troops and directed them to converge at the fortress. This is known as Dunker's radiation problem, and it's one of the most famous hypothetical problems in all of cognitive psychology. It illustrates the power of analogies, comparing two different situations and seeing how one might shed new light on the other. Note that similarities here are not surface level at first. Military strategy doesn't seem at all related to cancer treatment, but beneath the two stories is a deep structural similarity, small amounts of something coming from different directions and converging at a central location. And having an eye for those deep structures is a cornerstone of wide-ranging thought. A classic research finding is summarized like this. Breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. In other words, the more contexts in which something is learned, the more the learner can see past the surface of the problem and into its deeper structure. They then become better at applying that knowledge to situations they've never actually seen before. And that's the essence of creativity. So to supercharge your analogical thinking, expand your learning across a wide range of disciplines. And when tackling a new problem, think back to those insights you picked up from past challenges, even if they seem unrelated on the surface at first. By applying analogies and looking for deep structural similarities, you may just stumble upon a new discovery. At first, Montana's 1949 Man Gulch fire didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. But when the fire jumped across the gulch from one hill slope to another, the flames began to chase firefighters uphill at a rate of 11 feet per second. The crew foreman yelled at his men to abandon their heavy tools and sprint to safety, and 2 did so immediately and made it. But many more refused. They ran clutching their axes and saws and slowed down by the additional weight they were caught in the flames. One firefighter even stopped fleeing and sat down, exhausted, never having removed his heavy pack at all. In total, 13 firefighters died. Believe it or not, this puzzling phenomenon has also been well documented elsewhere. There were Navy seamen who ignored orders to remove their steel-toe shoes when abandoning a ship and drowned or punched holes right in the life rafts that were meant to save them. There were fighter pilots and disabled planes who refused orders to eject. And then there was Carl Wallenda, the world-famous high-wire performer, who fell 120 feet to his death when he lost his footing and grabbed first at his balance pole rather than the wire beneath him. These tragedies illustrate a very human inclination to cling to what we know, to use only the tools that have worked for us in the past. Psychologists call this the Einstellung effect, the tendency of problem solvers to employ only familiar methods even when better ones are obviously available. This is especially a challenge for specialists who become so accustomed to using a very specific set of tools and strategies that they often fail to imagine alternative approaches. As the saying goes, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. On the other hand, dropping one's tools is a proxy for unlearning, for adaptation, for flexibility, wrote the sociologist Carl Weick. And this is another area where generalists shine. By their very definition, generalists are used to moving beyond the familiar into new territories of learning, where they pick up new ways of seeing the world and new ways of solving problems. They're more adept at both dropping their familiar tools and acquiring new ones. So the next time you're faced with a unique or especially pressing challenge, don't feel bound to the strategies you've used in the past. If they're not well suited for the task at hand, dare to move beyond them, maybe try something completely new. It's that kind of adaptability that could make a difference, or, in extreme circumstances, even save a life. Frances Hesselbein never could have guessed where her career path would take her. As a girl, she dreamed of becoming a pilot, but later dropped out of junior college, got married, and started spending her day helping out in her husband's photography studio. When she was 34 years old, a prominent woman in her community paid her a visit to ask if she'd lead a local Girl Scout troop as a volunteer. Hesselbein agreed to stand in for 6 weeks until, she said, a permanent leader was found. But she ended up staying for 8 years. In 1970, she was selected as the new executive director of a local Girl Scout council. Fast forward to 1976, and Hesselbein's excellent work earned her an invitation to interview for the position of CEO. She was honest with the search committee, telling them about the dramatic changes she would make if she were in charge. More activities for the girls that focused on math and science and technology, plus a greater focus on diversity and inclusivity. To her surprise, the committee loved her ideas, and she became the CEO of the Girl Scouts of the United States of America. Under her leadership, minority membership tripled. The cookie business grew to more than $300 million a year. When she finally retired in 1990, the revered management expert Peter Drucker proclaimed her the best CEO in America. As a young woman, Hesselbein had no idea that she would be so well suited to volunteering, and certainly not to leading an entire 3 million member organization. She didn't discover those talents and interests until she dove in and gave it a try over and over. Her story is consistent with the findings of London Business School professor Herminia Ibarra. Her research has shown that the best way to maximize match quality is actually to sample different activities, social groups, jobs, and then reflect each time and adjust your path accordingly. This is the direct opposite of a lot of prevailing professional development narrative that assures us that we can find our one true calling if we simply spend enough time on intensive self-study, pure introspection. A lucrative personality quiz and career counseling industry survives on that very premise. But Hesselbein's story and Ibarra's research reveal a simple truth. We learn who we are by doing, not only by thinking. This is especially important given that who we are is actually constantly in flux. Studies show that our personality changes considerably over the course of our lives, and especially quickly between the age of 18 and our late 20s. So making a long-term professional plan often means trying to maximize match quality for a person who doesn't even exist yet. Which brings us to the biggest lesson from Hesselbein's story. Ditch your long-term plan. Hesselbein never even had one. She simply did what was interesting or needed at that particular moment again and again. In the same way, don't worry about landing the perfect job 20 years from now. Just focus on what's the best fit for you right now, today. Give it a try. There's a place for long-term planning, of course, after a period of sampling diverse experiences. But until you have that better sense of who you are and who you're becoming, short-term planning is the way to go. As we pursue a wide range of knowledge and skills, we have to embrace a variety of different learning techniques. But the most effective learning doesn't happen the way you might think. In one study, 2 rhesus macaque monkeys named Oberon and McDuff were shown various random pictures on a screen. A tulip, a school of fish, Halle Berry, etc. And they were tasked with memorizing them in a particular order. In some practice sessions, Oberon and McDuff were automatically given hints for the next picture in the sequence. For other lists, they could touch a hint box on the screen whenever they got stuck. And for the final group of lists, there were no hints available at all. When test day came, the memorizing monkeys had to recall all the lists, in order, from every training condition with no hints whatsoever. And it was a performance disaster. Oberon only got about 1/3 of the lists right, and McDuff got less than 1 in 5. There was, however, one exception. The lists on which they never had hints to begin with. For those lists, the duo had performed terribly on day 1 of practice, but they steadily improved. And on test day, Oberon remembered almost 3/4 of them, and McDuff nailed about half. Overall, the more hints that were available during training, the better the monkeys performed during early practice, and the worse they performed on test day. That may seem counterintuitive, but the monkey's performance starts to make sense when we turn to the science of human learning. Cognitive psychologist Nate Cornell writes about desirable difficulties, obstacles that make learning more challenging, slower, even more frustrating in the short term, but better in the long term. One of those desirable difficulties is visible in the generation effect, in which struggling to generate an answer on your own, even a wrong one, enhances subsequent learning. So when Oberon and McDuff repeatedly tried and failed to remember the list without any hints at all, they were making real progress in their learning, even though it didn't seem like it at the time. The science of human learning also tells us that what's called blocked practice, practicing the same thing repeatedly using the same procedure, leads to excellent immediate performance. But if you want knowledge to be flexible and easily applied to the many domains of a generalist, it should actually be learned under varied conditions, a type of practice called interleaving. For example, say you plan to visit a museum, and you want to be able to identify the artist of various paintings. Before you go, instead of studying a stack of, say, Cézanne flashcards, then a stack of Picasso flashcards, and then a stack of Renoir, you should put the cards together, shuffle them up so they become interleaved. You'll struggle more for sure, and you will feel less confident in identifying each artist during practice. But you'll be better equipped on museum day to discern each painter's unique style, even for paintings that weren't in the flashcards at all. So if you're learning something new to expand your range, remember the power of the generation effect and of interleaved practice and use them to your advantage. It's okay to get frustrated and wonder if you're making progress at all, but be patient. You may actually be on the right track. My first book was about genetics. After it came out, I received an unusual email from a 39-year-old muscular dystrophy patient. Her name was Jill Viles, and she believed that the gene mutation that had withered her muscles was somehow the same one that supercharged the muscles of a certain Olympic sprinter. It didn't seem likely, to say the least, but she had my attention. When she sent me a photo of herself, I saw her arms were strikingly skinny, same with her legs. She also sent me a photo of the sprinter Priscilla Lopes-Schleep, one of the best in Canadian history. The image showed her in mid-stride, ropes of muscle winding down her legs, veins bursting from her forearms. Honestly, I could hardly have imagined two women who looked less likely to share a biological blueprint. But in online pictures of Priscilla, Jill had recognized something in her own unique physique, a familiar pattern of missing fat on her limbs. Her theory was that she and Priscilla had the same mutated gene, but because Priscilla obviously doesn't have muscular dystrophy, her body was somehow making gigantic muscles instead of shrunken ones. To confirm her theory, Jill wanted my help convincing Priscilla to get a genetic test. The idea that a part-time substitute teacher wielding the cutting-edge medical instrument known as Google Images would make a major discovery about the DNA of a pro athlete struck me as somewhere between extremely unlikely and completely nuts. But Jill put a lot of work into researching the topic, and I felt like she deserved a response. When I connected Jill and Priscilla over the phone, they bonded right away. They talked about how they'd both been teased about their thick, bulging veins as kids. Priscilla actually agreed to get her DNA tested. A year later, we finally got the results, and Jill was right. She and Priscilla both have lipodystrophy, a disorder where the body struggles to make and maintain healthy fat tissue. Not only that, but they also have the exact same rare subcategory of lipodystrophy known as Dunnigan type. The typos in their DNA are neighbors on the same gene. And that tiny difference in location seems to make an extraordinary difference in their bodies, taking muscle and fat from Jill, but taking only fat from Priscilla while piling on incredible amounts of muscle. When the doctor called Priscilla with the news, she was out at lunch, and he told her that she could only have salad because she was actually on track for a pancreatitis attack. Due to her unmonitored lipodystrophy, Priscilla had 3 times the normal level of fat in her blood. She had to immediately overhaul her diet and started taking medication. With just Google Images, in her own self-directed reading, Jill had spurred a life-altering medical intervention for a professional athlete. And more than that, she made a small breakthrough in the field of genetics. As an outsider, with a background totally unlike those of most geneticists, she dared to pursue questions that most scientists wouldn't even think to ask, that most scientists she talked to thought were crazy. That unique perspective, combined with curiosity and obviously a bit of courage, is why outsiders can often have such an advantage. The more information that specialists create, the more opportunity exists for curious dilettantes and generalists to draw new conclusions by merging strands of widely available but disparate information. Lacking that tunnel vision that sometimes comes with specialization, outsiders see connections that others miss. They unearth what physicist and librarian Don Swanson called undiscovered public knowledge. So if a problem or project is interesting to you, don't shy away simply because you lack a traditional background for tackling it. This doesn't mean you don't have to talk to specialists and make a serious effort to learn, but the fact that you're not a specialist, but rather a curious outsider, is actually exactly what may give you a leg up. Whether we're pursuing excellence in school, in sports, or at the office, we're often pushed to choose a single focus and commit ourselves to it with unwavering dedication. But the world is full of so many fascinating things to learn, jobs to try, and people to meet. We ourselves are entire worlds worth exploring, with our myriad interests and talents just waiting to be discovered. So why should we feel pressured to specialize early, to limit ourselves to such a small sliver of all that life has to offer? Obviously, I don't believe we should, and the research often agrees. We've seen that head starts are overrated, that mid-career switchers are often winners. We've seen how generalists wield cognitive flexibility and analogical thinking to thrive in a wicked world. we've seen the benefits of dropping both your familiar tools and your long-term plans, and daring to take on difficult and new learning challenges. And finally, we've seen how dabblers and outsiders can synthesize others' expertise to produce new and valuable insights. All of this points to a simple conclusion. Having range is a competitive advantage. So if you're worried about falling behind, don't be. If you're afraid that it's too late to make a change, it isn't. And if you're uncertain about what to do next in life, that's perfectly okay. With so many diverse experiences behind you, and even more ahead, what comes next is truly a mystery. But whatever it is, your personal range is sure to serve you well.